is responsible for, oh, sorry, just saw that. The COG is thus responsible for ensuring that the administrative tasks related to obtaining funding from the county and ensuring that the invoices and progress reports are completed in time to make sure that this study does move on schedule. We're also exploring options to determine the best way to continue to share information about the study and findings for public viewership. And the interim website location is actually in the slide deck, but it's at sgvcog.org/waterprograms. And before we get started, I'd also like to thank all the consultants who've been working very hard and diligently on the study. So that includes the staff from WSP, Craft Water, and the Council on Watershed Health. And finally, I'd also really like to thank Don Patshower too from the city of Pasadena for also serving as the technical lead for the study for a very long time. Without all of their efforts and work, this work could not have been done so far without them. So without further ado, I'll actually pass it back to Matt from WSP and we'll start our presentation. Thank you.
Hi, thanks everyone, and really glad to see such a great turnout. It's really exciting. There's this many people really interested and fascinated in what we do, so I appreciate that. So my name is Matt Rich. I'm a principal program manager with WSP, and I'm going to attempt to share my slides here. And are the slides showing up?
Yep.
Okay, good. We're here, of course, to talk about the fire effects study in the Upper LA watershed management area. And so this is, as Nick was saying, this is a scientific study under the Safe Clean Water Program. And this is our first technical stakeholder group kickoff. And so we intend to have additional meetings as we make progress throughout the study to really hopefully get your input, at the very least communicate kind of what we're doing, but we want your input to make sure that we have, you know, as many great minds as possible advising us and so on. So the agenda for today, we'll give a brief introduction. We've already introduced ourselves a bit. And we'll start with study updates. And that's kind of the majority of the presentation. This goes through some of the early background of the study for those of you who aren't familiar and with it, and as a refresher for those who are. And then we'll talk about the progress that we've made to date, the work plan and monitoring. And then I'll turn it over to Craft Water to talk about modeling. We haven't done a whole lot yet, but Brianna does have a bit to talk about. And then to Ureli for stakeholder engagement and our strategy and what we've been doing for.
Hi, Matt. Sorry to interrupt. You are presenting the presenter view. So if you could just switch your screen sharing to the presentation, that would be good. Thanks.
Yes, thanks for letting me know that. Is that the same thing?
Same thing.
Matt, you got to go to slideshow and then unclick the use presenter view before you share.
Sorry, folks, that part I apologize for this. Belle, if you can share these correctly, maybe that'd be easier to do than watching me try to figure this out. Great. Okay. Sorry about the technical difficulties, folks. I think we've got it all set now. It looks good on my screen, at least. Is everybody else okay with that?
Yep.
Okay. Next slide then, Bill, please. Okay. So again, as Nick mentioned, we have the San Gabriel Valley COG is the project applicant. And until recently, Don was the special studies lead And she stepped out from that role. But but the San Gabriel Valley COG is still the direct applicant to the Safe Clean Water funding. And so they've contracted with us at WSP, and that's myself, to implement this study. And so again, with us, we have both Craft Water, Brianna, who is the modeling expert and will handle the modeling portion of the project, as well as Council for Watershed Health, which is really in charge of the stakeholder coordination and technical review. Also WSP, we have Kimberly Henry, Brenda Stevens, and Jeremy Burns in charge of various aspects of the project, monitoring, reporting, and project coordination, respectively. Next slide, please. So this is kind of the reason we started doing the study in the first place. So wildfires are fairly well known to produce pollutants, right? And previous studies, particularly by SQUIRT, have shown that there can be a dramatic increase in a number of different constituents after a fire. Both PAHs to some extent, but even that's 4 times higher in some cases, nitrogen, and then metals, and finally phosphorus, has been shown to be of over 900 times higher after a fire than it was prior to the fire. And so the fires can release chemicals in a lot of different ways, both by burning and converting them. That's a lot where the PAHs come from. But then the soil, it burns off the vegetation, of course, and then the soil washes through, as well as the ash. And the ashes can be very high in metals and the nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. So knowing that, next slide, please. We wanted to look at the impacts of wildfires on water quality itself. We know that it causes these problems. What does that actually do to the water? And so the impetus for the study is there's multiple TMDL requirements, and there's 62 impaired water body segments within the Upper LA River watershed. And we're also seeing over the past few years, although we've had a year or two of peace, but we've seen an awful lot of increased wildfire, both frequency and intensity of wildfires, especially in the Los Angeles region. And so when we look at these timelines for the TMDLs, they're coming up very, very quickly. In some cases within 2 years, within 2025, and then even still through almost 2030, but that's coming very, very quickly. And so looking at these TMDLs and trying to figure out how to address them, we thought that looking at the fires and impacts of fires could really be very beneficial to the science behind that, and potentially even the compliance points for that. Next slide, please. So the benefits and what we hope to get out of this study is, again, we're going to study the post-fire water quality and what happens to the effects from fires as they move through the water column, to better inform BMP design. And the benefits we think we'll be able to help identify, use this information to help identify and design effective management strategies to address the things that both come from fires and the things that don't, and be able to understand the difference between the two. We also want to, and part of the stakeholder group, is to inform the community on the impacts of wildfires on water quality. And finally, to help predict the impacts of water quality from future wildfires and other climate change scenarios. As climate change, these wildfires may continue to increase in intensity and frequency. And we want to be able to predict that impact on the water quality. The next slide. So the study approach, the green arrows on top are things that have already been completed, and on the bottom, the yellow is what we're working on. So initially, of course, we obtained the state clean water funding, and we started with a historical data review. There's not a whole lot out there of fires on water, but SQUIRT has done a bit of work on it. And we looked at that data and that study extensively. We need to coordinate with both that study as well as other studies that were similar throughout the region. So we use those to design a monitoring plan. And we have a technical advisory committee that helped us review that monitoring, that entire work plan for the project. That's now complete. And we've started implementing that program. And so this year we've conducted both dry weather and wet weather monitoring. And I'll talk more about them in a few minutes. But that was kind of really the first big step of actually doing something, was starting this new monitoring. And so we're in progress on that. We'll do that this year, continue that this year, and then into next year as well. And then also in progress, and part of what this meeting is for, is technical advisory and data analysis. So we have a technical TAC as well that that we talked to, and so that is ongoing, and that's part of this. So the next step is, once we have the data and have sorted through all the data that we collect through the monitoring, as well as data from other monitoring programs, then we'll really begin the modeling, the fire effects, and the potential effects of the climate change on those fires and on the result. And throughout the entire time, I think one important piece of this is that we've been collaborating with the regional board. And that was a very important part of this study from the beginning, is to make sure that they're aware of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it, and talking to them before we even get to the end of the study, before we even begin the study for that matter, on how these data may be able to be used. So we're still talking with them. In fact, we've got another meeting with them next week, I believe, set up. And so that's been very helpful. They've, as the regional board is, they've been helpful and interested in what we're doing. And so it's been good. We haven't received a whole lot of input from them, but they are interested in continuing to work with us, and we think that's very positive. The next slide, please. So I'm not going to read all of this, but basically we have three types of monitoring: dry weather, wet weather, and bioassessment. And really we're trying to, where each of those are tied to a different study question. So for dry weather, we want to understand how the post-fire runoff is affecting contaminant loading during dry weather. So just after a fire is burned, areas naturally flow through the water, flow downhill and into the river. How does that look like during dry weather? And then in wet weather, as we get storms that actually wash a lot more of that, as well as washing potentially ash and other aerial borne depositions into the water, how does that pollutant load in wet weather after a fire compared to between burned areas and unburned areas? And then finally, bioassessment monitoring, we hope that will help us understand what the factors are that influence how long those effects persist. So how long after a fire is the water affected potentially, and how long does that take? Does it change? Does it go down over time? Does it kind of stick around for a year and then go away? We don't know that yet, and then we're hoping to understand that through the bioassessment monitoring as well as the others. Next slide, please. So the analytes so we're taking the field water quality parameters as we kind of would on any monitoring program. Basically, we're looking for metals, nutrients, and PAHs. We're also looking at some additional things like chlorophyll to help tell us more about what the nutrients are doing in the water and how they're affecting the water, as well as a number of other metals besides copper and zinc that can also come from fires and can help us understand the various chemistry between pre-fire and post-fire. So a pretty good comprehensive list of nutrients that we believe may come from fires and would be affected by fires. Some other things are unlikely to and might add to the cost and didn't seem necessary. And these are the ones that we were focused on because that's what's been found in other studies that were even more comprehensive. Next slide, please. The potential monitoring areas. So we don't know, right? We don't know where the fires are going to happen. So the last fire was the Bobcat fire, and that's the one that we based our initial plan on, and we'll stick with that until hopefully there's not another fire in many ways. If there is, it'll give us more research opportunities, and that's the case we may switch these stations. So we don't need to go into these in detail, but you can see how they cover throughout the upper LA and Watershed. We have both dry and wet weather locations to try to capture the most direct input from the Bobcat fire that we can, both in outsoils and receiving water bodies. And these are all potentials based on where fires may occur in the future. These are the locations we've identified so that if a fire happens, for instance, a bit more west of the Bobcat fire, we've already got stations pre-identified that we would be able to move to monitor to get that information right away. And then next slide. So our first dry weather event, these are the locations that we sampled that in. And we were able to get to collect samples from all three sites. And I realized that water on the right-hand photo is very shallow, but we were careful to we're not scraping the bottom. We're getting the water and not the sediment that's on the bottom. So we were able to get 3 good dry weather samples on December 8th. Next slide. And these are results. I'm not going to read all these numbers, of course, but if you look at the averages column on the right-hand side, that'll show you that there were obviously detections of copper, zinc, phosphorus, chlorophyll, and so on. They're not astronomically high. We don't really know what these numbers mean in isolation, but just by looking at them, they're not astronomical, but they're not zero either. The PAHs were a bit of a mixed bag. We had some that were simply not detected, and some, again, PAHs are a group of compounds. And so this is kind of the range of the PAHs we found, anywhere from non-detect up to about 54, looks like nanograms per liter. So again, certainly within the range of being found, being detected, higher than plain water by all means, but they're not astronomical either. So we'll see what happens next. And then next slide, please. and I want to limit this data. Okay, this is one sample, all right, at 3 locations. So we only have data from one event. So we can't draw real conclusions from this. We also have the similar studies that were done in the past have a lot more wet weather data than dry weather. So we don't have a whole lot to compare these to. And others are looking at more than concentration, which we will look at more later on. But at this point, we just simply have some concentration. So I do want to highlight the limitations of the data set that we have so far, because we are just still beginning the study. And as our body of data grows, we'll be able to draw better conclusions. Next slide. And so here's what we can find in terms of the copper. So these are from a 2012 study done in California, and these are the results found for copper in this unburned site, both burned and unburned. And so the unburned ranges from 2 to 8. The post-fire is from 20 to 200. So there's a very big difference in those copper results pre and post-fire. So if we look at the next slide, we can see how our results so far compare. And they're between roughly 8 and 13 micrograms per liter. And so this is, at this point, really more comparable to the unburned area. Now, again, we can't draw any conclusions from one sample, especially one dry weather sample at this point. But so far, and again, we are a year, 2 years, we believe, is it 3, away from the Bobcat fire. So maybe that's telling us something there. But again, these are comparable to the unburned areas. Don't know what that means yet, but that's just kind of where the range falls right now. Next slide, please. So zinc, it's a similar story. The unburned in prior studies, unburns runs up to around 20 milligrams per liter, and the post-fire can get up to 300. Again, a dramatic difference, over a 10-fold difference. And if we look at the next slide, similar again to what we saw for zinc is that, or I'm sorry, for copper, the zinc results are similar. They're similar to the unburned watershed. Again, does not really tell us much at this point, but that just kind of gives a frame of reference for what we found so far. Next slide, please. Now, in wet weather, I'll move on from, that was the dry weather sampling, and now I'm going to move into the wet weather sampling. And we had some protocol changes from our original work plan. Originally, we had intended to get an encroachment permit, and we would install a small amount of equipment, sort of not permanently, but sort of a little bit more long term, and then have some temporary equipment installation right before a storm that would capture, using automated equipment to capture multiple aliquots and get a composite sample. Well, the permitting turned out to be a significant challenge for us, requiring a substantial amount of work, engineering plans, and so on, which was not only a really astronomical amount of work for the project overall, but knowing that our sites may change based on the future fires and we would have to start that over, we thought, okay, wait, we want to get sampled started. We want to start sampling the wet weather this year. Going this route's not going to work. So we did change. If we go to the next slide. We moved over in the first wet weather event in January. We did a pilot study by collecting manual graphs. And so we still collected a composite sample. We just did it manually instead of with the automated equipment, and that eliminated the need for the engineering drawings and so on for the access permit. It worked really well, and we were able to collect. The storms were slightly different, but we went with the Stormwater Monitoring Coalition's guidance for grab compositing, and we were able to collect at least a dozen aliquots, usually in most cases more, over the course of the storm to turn into a composite sample. And we flow weighted those composites based on estimated flow. So we have flow weighted composite samples throughout the storm. And we went back and reviewed the hydrographs and so on, so they're representative. So we had 3 wet weather events so far this year, first in January, then February, and then one in the beginning of March. Next slide, please. And similar to the dry weather, we have some results here. Again, those averages. The zinc looks a bit higher in this case, but the copper, the nitrogen don't seem astronomical. A lot of the PAHs are NDs. In fact, even the higher end were J values, which means they're sort of estimated because they're fairly low. But again, zinc showed up an awful lot in the wet weather. So we kind of go back through the same things we did with the dry weather. Let's see how those results compare to prior studies. Next slide. So for total copper, once again, we saw the same thing we saw in dry weather, that the copper concentrations were pretty comparable to the unburned areas of the former reference site, Arroyo Seco. And so they're maybe a little bit higher, but very similar to those unburned ranges. Next slide. And for zinc, now the zinc, again, this one's right in the middle. It's not as high as the burned areas that we saw in previous studies, but it is a little bit above the unburned areas. And we saw that in the table with a 66, I believe it was 66 point something micrograms per liter. That was a lot higher than the dry weather. So we have seen some effect from zinc. We're not sure if that's from the fires or from some external or some different type of situation. Again, we don't have a whole lot of data yet to look at, but these were higher. So that may have something to do with it. Next slide. Okay, that's all I have on the monitoring and the work plan. Next, we'll move into modeling, but we wanted to stop here after each kind of basic section of this presentation and see if anyone has any questions or any other comments or topics for discussion. So I'll turn it over to all of you. And I see Jerry has his hand up.
Yeah, I was having a little trouble telling what you were saying with the pause. The range you're giving there is individual pause, not a total pause.
Right, that's correct.
Okay, so that's really, we need to make that clear because that'll get confusing as we move through this process.
Okay, we do have the total results as well, the total pH results as well. And we'll probably, ultimately, you've got a good point, Jerry. We'll probably use the total pH concentration more in our overall analysis than the individuals, but that was meant to just show a range of what those individual things could be.
And it always gets more fun when you got J values hidden amongst them.
Of course, yes.
Okay, that's it for now. I'm going to be heading out to another meeting for the LA permit group, but thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing how this progresses. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jerry. Appreciate it. I see another Luca, I believe, raise your hand.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, great presentation. I have a couple of questions. I'm not super familiar with the water sampling, but I was wondering, first of all, what do you think like you're looking for in terms of like for a fire could burn like just vegetation or it could burn structures too. So I'm assuming that like with structures, the pollutants and like the chemicals in the watershed might change significantly. And the second question that I had is like about the concentrations. So in the dry measurements, you have a very like low amount of water. So how does that compare to like the wet measurements where you have like, you know, a big flow with, let's say like, I don't know, similar concentrations?
Okay, sure. So for your first question about structures being burned, the fires that we're kind of focused on and we're looking at in LA, these are meant to be wildfires. It's not meant to be urban fires. So we're trying to look for wildfires, which would be up in the hills. Now, obviously, there are and may be structures that get caught in those fires. And by all means, you know, we would see what's coming downstream after that structure gets burned. Now, hopefully there aren't a whole lot, and there aren't a whole lot that have a whole lot of toxic materials, but we would expect to see potentially some more of those metals and nutrients coming from burned structures as well. So we're not specifically accounting for that. We're just kind of looking at the hillsides and the more open space areas of wildfires rather than down inside an urban situation. And your second question about concentrations or about the levels in dry. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, dry weather flow is very, very, very small compared to wet weather. At least we always hope it is. And that's part of the reason that really affects load primarily. Okay, that affects the total amount of those constituents that are going through the water and they're there in the water. That would be a load. So what we're looking at is concentrations, and we will look at loads later on by estimating the total volume of water. But when we compare concentrations, we can tell that's the different, right? It's irrelevant how much water there is. The concentration in the water that's there is this much. And so for the time being, at least, we're looking at concentrations. just to get these ranges and do some initial kind of looks at where the data fall based on that concentration rather than based on the load. So we will look at loads later. Loads can be a little tricky. It's kind of a long story, but I mean, there's so much. It's so tough to really get a good solid measurement of that volume of water, right? No matter what equipment you're using, if you have fully engineered channels and so on, I mean, we can get pretty good estimates of that flow. But again, just a small amounts of flow can really change. You have a much bigger effect on the total load than the concentration does, really. Whether the concentration is low or high, when you have a lot more water, you have 1,000 times as much water, you're going to get a lot more, right? So in this case, we're just looking at concentrations, but I think that's a good question. It is a good point that in many cases, we're looking, the total amount of the constituent that enters the waterway is at least as important, if not more important to us than the actual concentration at a time. So
thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your questions. And let me see, you have the chat. Okay. So I see a question in the chat. Did we take into account different percentages of soil burn severity in the sampling? No, we have not done that yet. I'm not sure if we'll be able to. It really depends on the fires that happen, right? We have one fire at this point, the Bobcat fire. And we are a little, once we get down into the upper LA River, we are a little bit removed from that burn area. So we've not taken that into account yet. But if you have ideas or examples of how we might be able to, we're certainly happy to consider them. Okay. And would be another question is, would we be able to take measurements for prescribed burns? So this is kind of an intentional, if I understand the question correctly, if there's some intentional burning to prevent future fires from getting out of hand. That looks like that was Luca. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, sorry, that's those are like controlled burns, like in areas, for example, for like fuel reductions or like reduced vegetation. And yeah, like you basically set a prescribed fire and in like a certain perimeter. I was wondering if that's something you might be interested in, like for the water measurements.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and that would certainly be a way to get more data. We're trying to kind of keep this one local to the upper LA River. I'm not sure how much is done within that watershed in terms of, fire control burns. I'm not quite sure how I'd find that out. Maybe California Fire, the Cal Fire would have something. I think that's a great idea, actually. I mean, that would be a really good way to get more data. I think finding the right time and place with the waterway that comes out of there might be a little tough odds to actually get samples, but I think that's a good idea. I think we should actually take a look at that and try to consider if that's a possibility, because that could give us much more immediate, kind of right on the spot information as opposed to the down. Well, I mean, downstream is kind of what we're interested in, but still, I think that's a good idea. I think we'll take that into consideration. Thanks. Okay, other questions on the monitoring or other technical aspects of this? If not, we can move into modeling. And we'll certainly have time at the end of the presentation overall for any follow-up questions as well. So if another one comes up, then we'll be happy to answer it. And I saw one more pop into the chat from Jack Webster. What is the vegetation cover in the area? All chaparral. And the hillsides, yes, where the burn is, that's essentially all chaparral. I believe there may be a little bit of forest, but I believe it's all chaparral up in those hills. And so again, we're not looking at the urban area, we're kind of looking at the upstream. To the best of my knowledge, and if anyone else has a better understanding of what's on those hillsides that burned in the Bobcat fire, my belief is it's either all chaparral or predominantly chaparral. But if someone knows better, please jump in. Okay, well, Brianna, and Belle, if you want to jump to the next slide, and Brianna jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Belle, if you want to just click a few times, there's a few animations on this slide. So when it comes to the modeling focus of the study, the intent is really to look at the broader potential impacts to stormwater runoff and the associated pollutants. If fires were to continue to occur more frequently, and also to look at the potential if they were to occur directly in this watershed and what that impact would be. So this is kind of showing the overall framework of the modeling, where we are using the monitoring data that's being compiled that Matt kind of just walked through, but we're also including some of the historic data that has been collected across other watersheds with fire impacts. And that will be used to really characterize this post-fire landscape within the watershed model. So we're looking at how designated land uses and other environmental changes resulting from the fires impact the typical baseline pollutant loadings from stormwater runoff in the watershed. We are planning to run multiple scenarios on the range of these potential post-fire impacts, and we're going to go into the details a little bit further in the next slide. But in addition to just the, oh, sorry, go back one more. So in addition to just looking at the post-fire landscape changes, the modeling will also incorporate a range of climate change scenarios, which have the potential to obviously further exacerbate the fire impacts and those typical pollutant loadings. Now, based on these scenarios in terms of the post-fire landscape and the climate change, we will evaluate the changes to that baseline pollutant loading, comparing that to our current estimates, with really a focus on the total runoff volumes, sediment, metals, and nutrients as the primary pollutants that we're modeling. Next, the modeling framework will look at how these baseline changes actually impact the performance of best management practices or BMPs that are planned within the watershed. So the focus is really on evaluating the impacts to constructed or currently planned projects that have been identified by the Watershed Management Group in Upper LA. And so then the range of those expected pollutants to be reduced by the projects under the different scenarios will then be evaluated and compared to the existing water quality targets that are established within this region. So ultimately, as Matt kind of said at the beginning, we're hoping that this will help to inform more resilient management strategies by assessing the differences across these potential impacts in the future. So you go to the next slide, Belle. So diving in a little bit further on the baseline changes, when we look at kind of the foundation of the model is within LSPC, and that's really leveraging the watershed model that already exists for the watershed management program in this region. Under the post-fire impacts, we are looking at 3 to 4 scenarios representing either kind of more of a moderate to a more severe or extreme burned area. We are going to vary that based on the spatial and temporal coverage. And then this will really be done primarily through adjusting the hydrologic response units, representing the land use and land cover within the watershed model, and also exploring adjusted hydrology and water quality calibration. That's really going to rely on, the data collected pre and post fires to inform. We also are planning to integrate potential impacts from atmospheric deposition, which will most heavily rely on available literature, and again, look at kind of a range or a sensitivity analysis of the extent that any atmospheric deposition could impact the overall baseline pollutant loading within the watershed. Then across the climate change scenarios, we are planning to look at 2 to 3 scenarios of, again, kind of more moderate to potentially extreme climate change conditions. This will be done primarily through adjusting your input files that represent our weather in terms of the expected precipitation and the evapotranspiration, as well as looking at the more kind of historic extremes that are anticipated to be more prevalent, such as, where we had more high intensity storms or more extended dry periods. And so then the results of these baseline changes, we are going to summarize in a watershed model report that will kind of summarize the results of this effort. Go to the next slide. The second piece of the modeling, as I mentioned, is really to evaluate the impacts of potential BMP performance under these different conditions. So using, again, those post-fire and the climate change scenario outputs, these will be our inputs now to our existing BMP models for projects that have already been either, I said, constructed or that are planned within the watershed already. And this is actually being done in coordination with the PRECIP. That is a study that is also ongoing within this watershed that, as the map shows, has identified a number of projects throughout. So from those projects that we've identified, we are going to make sure that we look at a range of different types of BMPs to compare their performance. And again, kind of the expected runoff capture and the pollutant load reduction that they can achieve under these different baselines. So the primary purpose is really to explore any design adjustments that could result in kind of a more resilient BMP design across the different conditions. We'll also look at potential operations and maintenance considerations with these changing conditions, if there needs to be additional kind of debris removal more often, and see how we can still try to optimize the performance of BMPs in the long term. So the results of that BMP modeling will be integrated with the pre-SIP platform, which is part of another scientific study that is wrapping up in this watershed actually this year. And that will present out the various performance of these BMPs throughout the watershed, again, under these different scenarios of post-fire and climate change. So next slide. As I mentioned earlier, we are using the data collected directly under the study. We're also relying on historic data that we have available either within the watershed or where there were pre and post-fire monitoring sites in Southern California in particular. We tried to use that, and that's going to help us inform the parameterization of those post-fire landscape scenarios. So you'll see here we have across the San Gabriel River, Ventura County, Orange County, and Riverside County that we were able to receive data for monitoring sites that were either directly impacted by fires or where post-fire monitoring was directly conducted. We're also referencing a number of data compiled by SCORP, a bit of what Matt was going through earlier on the fire impacts throughout various areas in Southern California. So this again kind of lists out the data that we compiled to date, but I did want to open it up here and get any input from this group. If there is any additional suggestions for known data that would be available that could help us in terms of some of the parameterization. Again, we're really focused on where we might be able to identify that there's been pre and post-fire monitoring to inform how we're setting up the inputs for our model. So I'll pause there and see if there's any initial input or questions from folks. And then I'll also just add, I think too, as you go through this, feel free, I think you could have Belle's contact through this invite. If there's additional studies or additional data that you know is going to be available after this point, please feel free to contact us and send that data our way. That would be very appreciated as we use it for our effort. All right, I think hearing none, Belle, if you go to the next slide, I think we're just going to pause here again and see if there's any questions or initial feedback on the modeling piece of this study. Again, we're very much in the beginning phases of it, but there will be more to share at later meetings in terms of some of the actual modeling results. I don't think I'm seeing any hands or anything in the chat. Oh, what kind of BMPs will you evaluate in the model? So the BMPs that we are representing are the ones that, as I mentioned, have been identified by the Watershed group. So a lot of them are, some of the infiltration galleries, there are some wetlands that we do want to look at as well. Some of the larger kind of just storage facilities. So we want to vary the types of BMPs that we're looking at. But again, those are the ones that are represented within the watershed management program that the Upper LA River group is looking to potentially implement to meet their compliance needs. I think I see another question in the chat. So does the model take into consideration the role of dams in the mountains on the pollutants? So the model in itself sometimes has certain dams the larger dams are represented within the model. And so we aren't explicitly making any direct changes in terms of those dams at this time. Again, we're more focused on the potential landscape changes as we're representing that. But if there is additional information that comes in terms of the actual dam dynamics that potentially change, we could integrate that. Any other questions regarding the modeling? All right, and I think at the end of this, we'll also have another kind of opportunity for any questions or feedback. But hearing none, I think I will pass it over to the Council for Watershed Health to go through some of the stakeholder engagement.
Hi, thanks, Brianna. So I'm going to be reviewing our stakeholder engagement plans. And so our stakeholder engagement is mainly going to be motivated by the following goals here. So we want to make sure that we're creating opportunities for stakeholders to share data and expertise about wildfire, that we're leveraging and coordinating with closely related efforts, that we create and take advantage of opportunities to share results with stakeholders that would be impacted and interested in our study results, and that we're promoting knowledge on wildfire impacts to water quality and develop effective management strategies. And we also want to create and take advantage of opportunities to integrate early feedback from decision makers and interested parties on potential policy changes that might result as part of the study. Next slide, Belle. And so what we did as part of our engagement strategy is we developed these 4 stakeholder types, and the avenues for engagement change a little bit depending on the stakeholder type. And so we have, through the study, we'll be engaging technical folks. And so these are the folks that can provide guidance on the approach, share data, and support leveraging efforts to make better use of our limited resources and to make use of those resources more efficiently. We want to make sure, and we'll be engaging affected parties. So these are the stakeholders that are going to be affected by the decisions that are precipitated from the study. There are going to be outcome stakeholders who are interested in some of the products that result from the study and some of the deliverables that we put together that can inform their own work potentially. And then general outreach to folks that have a broad interest in forests, water quality, and the impacts of wildfires. And here we have sort of logos showing the examples of the entities that fall under each stakeholder category type. Next slide. And so our stakeholder engagement plan has 6 phases. And so we will be, again, coordinating closely with the regional board since they are going to be affected by the outcomes of this study. We will be engaging with those technical folks through TAC meetings, and then with one-on-one meetings with folks that might have data or conducting closely related studies or can help us leverage this work. And same goes for the technical stakeholder group meetings. And then we want to make sure that we provide an opportunity for us to meet in person and to go out and see some of the BMPs that might be impacted by fire. So maybe some potential lake sites, former burn sites to sort of see what's happening on the ground. And then we are going to be engaging folks and potentially more the general stakeholder group type by presenting our studies at local meetings, symposia, and at local conferences. And then we will have a concluding webinar after the study has concluded to share out results. Next slide. And so this is where we are so far. We have, and we are regularly meeting with the regional board. We have quarterly meetings, and we have a couple under our belt now. We have been providing regular updates to our TAC technical advisory group and meeting with some of the technical experts that are providing data and feedback. And then today's meeting is a technical stakeholder group meeting where we're providing opportunity for y'all to share out and share your expertise or share data and provide input into the study. And we will be coming back to you all in late summer to give you more information about some of the interim study progress. The next phase of engagement, like I mentioned, will be going out and doing site and BMP tours. If anyone knows of any good sites to take out our technical group and some of our outcome and affected party stakeholders, please share those with us in the chat or during the Q&A portion of this. And then we are looking at opportunities to share the study and the study results again at local conferences. And so we're, we still haven't done that and are looking for opportunities to do that. And then we will be coming back to you at the end of the study to share our results. And so all of those items are still pending on the bottom here. And so I want to provide an opportunity for you all to share any comments or concerns about the engagement strategy. And again, if you have any feedback on good sites for us to visit, or if there are folks that you think should be part of this meeting that you don't see on our email list or are not part of the TSG meeting now, please elevate those recommendations to us. Okay, and if anyone thinks of any recommendations for the engagement strategy, again, we'll come back at the end, and then you can always email Belle and I if anything, if you have any questions that arise. Matt, do you want to go ahead and go through next steps, since it looks like the group is pretty quiet?
We have a question from Mary Miller. Can local participants of this call and attend the field meetings?
So we are still brainstorming on exactly what those tours are going to entail. Right now, our plan is to have the technical folks and the affected parties attend. But as we find more funding and as we find funding to support those tours, we'll be looking to opportunities to open it to the wider group. So Mary, if you're interested, we'll hold on to your contact information.
Thank you, everybody. Any other questions or comments on engagement? Or any other comments? Any other input? We've had a couple good ideas so far, obviously, so we've already gotten quite a bit out of this meeting. Appreciate that. We're scheduled for another hour. We didn't think it'd take quite 2 hours, but we do want to make sure that we do have plenty of time at this point for any other conversation, discussion, or comments. Luca.
Yeah, sorry, I meant to raise my hand. I put too many reactions.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, I was wondering, so when you talk about engagement, do you mean like engagement with the public or engagement between the stakeholders? Or yeah.
All the above, but Yarly, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, so we will have more focused engagement with our stakeholders, with the technical stakeholders and the affected party stakeholders in particular, but we do have forums to engage stakeholders more generally. So that would be at sort of the conferences and the meetings where folks could participate and give feedback. And there are also going to be study updates and study information sheets that are available via the COGS website that Nick went through in early in the presentation that are on our slides. So those are ways that the general public, if interested, can learn more about the study.
Got it. Thanks. And yeah, as part of the UC cooperative extension, I would definitely be interested in like collaborating on the engagement part and if possible, so like the technical part. And yeah, I don't know if by being in this call, I'm automatically in the group or not. So I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah,
Thank you, Luca.
Right, we'll maintain this email list and hopefully it'll even grow. But if you're on there now, you won't probably get off of it until you tell us to stop bugging you, I think.
All right, thanks.
I see another question from Kara, and we do have a couple more slides on the next steps, but from Kara, you may have already mentioned this, will any reports produced as part of these efforts be publicly available? And the answer is yes. Again, Safe Clean Water, the whole project is publicly available. It's publicly funded. But yes, to make that easier on people, we can send things to either this group. We have a website that'll have more information as well. And yes, these will certainly be made public. And I guess we haven't quite gotten to the point of whether we're going to proactively email these to everybody or simply say, here they are, here's a link to them, or they're available. But yes, they will certainly be available to the public. Okay, Belle, do you want to move to the next slide? And so the next steps, we're watching for the weather. We only intended to do 3 wet weather events this year, and we did all 3, but we will still do dry weather monitoring throughout the year, at least to some extent. And we'll be watching for wet weather again starting next fall. Of course, fire watch. Although the weather lately doesn't look much like fires, we all know that, real wet spring can sometimes lead to a really bad fire season in August and September. So hopefully that won't happen. But if it does, of course, we'll be ready to go try to collect data from there. And we still have some wet weather data that we haven't collected, or that we haven't gotten back from the lab and gotten all QA yet. So we'll get that data back together. The event that happened in March, the lab is still working on that. We should have that anytime now, but they're still working on that. We have to do QA and so on. So those are kind of the next steps for now, is to continue the monitoring, continue gathering data, and continue engaging with the public. And then once we have a bit more data, then we'll jump into the modeling phase as well, still collect a little bit more data and go from there. Next step, or next slide. And this is our contact information. Again, myself from WSP, Nicholas from San Gabriel Valley COG, Brianna from Craft Water, and Ureli from Council for Watershed Health. You have our email addresses there. So thank you all, and still happy to take any questions or any comments. And Nicholas, do you want to add anything else at the end?
Nothing else too, but yeah, I mean, for those who attended, thank you for coming as well. If you do have any other follow-up questions, you have our contact information, like Matt said. But yeah, feel free to just reach out to us directly if anything comes up. But yeah, thank you for also all the feedback. We'll do our best to incorporate that into our work.
And thank you, everybody. It's really great to see this much interest in the study. Appreciate that.
All right, thank you all.
Okay, thank you all, and we will see you next time.